can get started. We have a really wonderful program today about the life and works of Josef and Anni Albers. And joining us today is Nicholas Fox Weber, who is a cultural historian and has been the executive director of the Josef and Anni Albers Foundation for the past 4 decades. During this time, he's worked tirelessly to preserve the lasting achievements and legacies of the Alberses. He's written extensively on each artist, recently completing an unprecedented visual biography of these icons of 20th century art. Other books of his include artists such as Le Corbusier and Bauhaus. He's currently in the process of writing a groundbreaking new biography of artist Pete Mondrian. And he also spearheads Le Corsa, a nonprofit organization he founded in 2005 to assist with medical care and education in Senegal. We are really fortunate to have Nicholas Fox Weber joining us today so that we can learn more about our famous local artist, Josef and Anni Albers, and the amazing collection of prints that adorn the walls of Cape Memorial Library. So thank you, Nick, for coming today. We're really excited to hear what you have to say.
Well, thank you so much, Rebecca, and I'm thrilled to be here. If we could go to the first image, please. Anni and Josef Albers would be exceptionally pleased that I'm speaking in effect in Orange. I'm not physically in Orange today, but thanks to modern media, I am. They loved the town. It was where they chose very deliberately to spend the last years of their lives. They really discovered Orange in part because they were looking at various towns near to New Haven. Josef had been teaching at Yale, and they had been living on North Forest Circle in New Haven, and they discovered the cemetery in Orange, and they decided that it was really where they wanted to be buried. And it was on that basis that they went and found a house in the town at 808 Birchwood Drive. They were very happy with the house that was available to the two of them. And let's see, Josh, I think we're skipping forward. If we can go back to the image of Josef, or great, that would be wonderful, thank you. If we, they were happy to find a house being built by a contractor. Josef was from the renowned Bauhaus school, as was Anni, a great art school in Germany associated with leading architects, but they believed that the best people to build houses were well-trained engineers, and they were very happy with what they found at 808 Birchwood Drive. It might be slightly strange to be starting with the cemetery, but many of you are familiar with the town cemetery, and the Alberses cared about aesthetics in every possible way, and they felt that the cemetery had a lovely feeling to it, and they bought 4 grave plots for their 2 graves right next to one of the roads going through the cemetery. And they had the idea that whichever of them died first, the other would make it a daily habit to go to the post office, pick up the morning's mail. Now remember, this is before the age when so much was done through email. Pick up the mail, drive into the cemetery, roll down the window, and in a certain way, read it in the company of the other. And I heard them discuss this plan with complete acceptance of the reality of death, and an idea that this was going to be a very appropriate way to remain together while one survived the other. And in fact, that is what happened after Josef died in 1976. Now, I want to briefly introduce you to these 2 remarkable people. Maybe we could go back to the image of Annie for a moment, please. Annie was born in 1899 in Berlin. She was a very, very independent woman from the word go. She grew up in a luxurious household where the expectations were that she would grow up in order to raise a family and instruct the cook what to make for dinner and have a dressmaker. Not that she would work, but from the time she was very young, she knew that she wanted to be an artist, and her mother arranged for her to have a tutor at home. Annie then went and studied art with a painter named Martin Brandenburg, who famously told her she was not allowed to use black in her artworks. And Annie, who had fallen in love with a jet black color in a Lucas Cranach painting in Berlin, went home to her mother in tears, and her mother said she had to go back and agree never to use black and apologize to her teacher. And here you see her characteristically in front of a print that she made with a very rich jet black in it. Annie was someone who would always have her way. If we can go on to Josef again, please. Josef became world renowned for his paintings called the Homages to the Square. You see a group of them behind him in this image. Josef was born in 1888, very different background from Annie's. His family was working class. His father was basically a building contractor, but of a really just a carpenter who also knew electricity, plumbing, house painting, and so on. And Josef was extremely proud of the technical skills that he learned from his father. And the two of them met, Josef being 11 years older than Annie, at the Bauhaus school, which was created in 1919 by the architect Walter Gropius in the town of Weimar in Germany. So you have these people who would end up in Orange, Connecticut, with one starting in Berlin in Germany, the other in the city of Bottrop, and the two of them meeting in Weimar. Next image, please. Annie took textiles to such directions that she was considered the foremost textile artist of the 20th century. This is an evaluation one hears from so many different authorities. She grew up in an atmosphere of brocades and flower patterns and damasks and everything very formal and figurative. And she simply thought that the intertwining of threads was a wonderful and lasting source of beauty. What made the work succeed physically was also what made it succeed aesthetically. She didn't believe in disguising materials with patterns, but rather in making the components of the material the essence of her art. She eventually became the first woman artist, as well as the first textile artist, to have a solo exhibition in New York at the Museum of Modern Art in 1949. Next image, please. Josef, as I said, gained his reputation really all over the world through the paintings of squares that he began in 1950, which was the same year that he and Annie moved to the New Haven area, having been at Black Mountain College in North Carolina. And these squares became so popular internationally that eventually one was used on a US postage stamp and therefore printed in an edition of 170 million. This was shortly after Josef died, but Annie and I both felt it would have been a source of great pride to him. The squares, I will get to in an explanation of what this beautiful, simple format facilitated. Next, please. Here's the house where they lived at 808 Birchwood Drive. Some of you probably know this house. It looks very different today, but when the Alberses were there, it reflected their wish never to disguise anything, so you have no foundation planting, but rather exposed concrete of the foundation. The only add-on following Joseph's death was the railing on the front steps added by the architect from New Haven, a man called King Louis Wu. You see the Alberses Mercedes-Benz there. It was their one real, shall we say, material luxury, given that at the end of Joseph's life, they became very successful financially and could have lived in a grander way if they had so chosen and had a lot more material luxuries. But what they wanted to do was create. And by living in a simple house, which they kept very bare inside, they could proceed with their work, with their creativity. When they were in their 70s and 80s, and that's when I knew them, they were incredibly youthful because they were both engaged in the act of creating. And there may be some of you in the audience today who remember them. And if so, I'm sure you remember Annie and Joseph's great vitality, the alertness with which they approached everything in the world. They were people who were in the act of making art right until the end of their lives. And this house in Orange was their paradise. It was the place where they had the freedom and the physical surroundings that made a lot possible. This simple house on Birchwood Drive was, by the standards of some, a scene of unexpected events. I can look at that picture of the entrance and remember in 1978 going in one day with the very glamorous Jacqueline Onassis, who was thrilled to call on Annie in that very simple house, and was very honored when Annie turned to her and said, "Mrs. Onassis, have you heard of the Bauhaus?" And Jackie simply said, "What a great honor it was to be there." There were museum curators from all over the world who came to the house, great art collectors, some of the world's most renowned photographers who would go there to capture the Alberses at home. Another great advantage to this house for them, and part of their choice of its location, was how simple it was to give directions to people coming from New York on the Meriden and the Wilbercross Parkway. And I can still hear Annie's voice saying very, very clearly, you take exit 57, you go to the third traffic light, you wait for the green arrow, then you turn left, and there you are, with the second driveway on the left. It was nice to have something so simple that served the purposes of others at this stage when they often had fascinating callers. Although they lived a very modest social life, never went out in the evening, and lived simply in order to work on their art. Next, please. Joseph started as a figurative artist. After he died, I found a number of drawings like this one of a rabbit that you see in the images in front of you. He then, when he got to the Bauhaus, began to make artworks out of glass pieces that he found that had commercial use and that he assembled to great effect, loving the beauty of light passing through colored glass, giving it a real religious feeling. Next. Next image, thank you so much. And then Joseph also was a furniture maker at the Bauhaus School. He created furniture that was exceedingly simple in design, based on the beauty of interlocking planes and the rare use of color, as in these stacking tables. These stacking tables, which have recently been reproduced and are now sold in an edition created by the Museum of Modern Art, and the chair, which is also currently going back into production. These both come from the period after Annie and Joseph had met and when they were at the Bauhaus School, which I mentioned to you before. Next, please. I think great. And here you see another glass construction by Josef. Annie and Josef were married in 1925 in Berlin. And I'd like for you to picture for a moment a scene in that kitchen in orange. I was then 26 years old, Josef 86, Annie 75. And she told me in front of Josef, "Can you imagine?" And then she explained that she was Jewish, he was Catholic. He was 11 years older. He was an abstract artist doing work that no one could understand and hardly making any money, although he had just become one of the first students to be elevated to the position of teacher at the Bauhaus. And Annie said it was time, quote, to meet the parents. And so on the streets of Weimar, where the Bauhaus was, she sold some beads. She was able to get Josef a proper suit. She said he used to wear jackets with a Mao type collar, and she noticed that he got served late in restaurants, and she thought that if he was in a proper suit, things would improve for that meeting with mother and dad. In any case, they went home to her parents' very fancy house on Monika Strasse in Berlin. And Annie said to me, and Josef was beaming at me as she said this, "How do you think my parents reacted given all those differences?" And then she smiled and said after 15 minutes, her mother looked at Josef and said, "Young man, our Anka is so difficult and you're so wonderful. You can come home to us anytime." This was what the Alberses were like. They were in many ways self-deprecating, funny, and modest, and interested above all, and I've said this before, in the making of art and in visual rhythm, as you see in this collage of staircases in Geneva, and as you see in the stained glass piece from 1926. Next, please. Next. Annie, as I said, grew up under conditions of great luxury. This is a photograph taken inside her parents' house, which was still standing and is still standing when I went and took this picture of it. Annie was brought up, as I said, with the expectation that she would be able to lead the sort of life with which she grew up. Her parents gave costume parties where she loved the transformation of the family's apartment into a different exotic setting. It once became the great park, the Grunwald near Berlin. On another occasion, it became a train station. Annie loved all acts of transformation. When she was a child growing up, she said that she used to go to hear the Berlin Symphony Orchestra with her sister Lotta, who was 18 months younger than she, and that they would wear black dresses, black velvet dresses with white silk collars and cuffs. And this is a later picture, but she's still in black with a white collar and white cuffs. Simplicity appealed to her greatly. And in any case, at those orchestra performances, what she liked the most was the orchestra tuning up, the sense of the components coming together and what it takes to make an artwork. Process and technique interested her enormously. Next, please. Once Annie got to the Bauhaus, and if we could flip back to that image of the two textiles, please. Once she got to the Bauhaus, she began weaving abstractions, and in the textiles which flashed on the screen before, there they are. You could see that, like Josef, she was drawn toward the power of straight lines. She remarkably made this piece on your left in 1923. Imagine, it's about is tall as a human being, made simply with black and white and gray thread. Nothing but straight lines became what for Annie was, and I quote, a visual resting place. She thought of art as balm to the soul, a chance to relax. And through straight lines, through simple balance, through simple forms, she created a new world that was harmonious and easy to look at. She quickly began to vary that new world. So as you can see in the work on your right, she went from a system of simple balance to one with greater rhythm, where there is a sense of mirror images, but the more you look, the more you realize that they're not quite mirror images or reverse mirror images, although they are close to that. Annie would play with systems. You would think you see a system in her work, and then you're surprised. These wonderful pieces, by the way, are currently on view in a fantastic museum show in Valencia in Spain, following a very large show of Annie and Joseph's work at the Musée de l'Art Moderne, the Museum of Modern Art in Paris, where Annie and Joseph's work attracted record-breaking crowds and unparalleled attention in this very, very fine museum. Next, please. In 1933, the Bauhaus School was closed because the Third Reich had stopped paying faculty salaries. And in 1932, the school had to leave Dessau, which is where it had its second headquarters following Weimar, and they went to Berlin. And once the school had closed, they had an opportunity to reopen the school, they being the school director, Mies van der Rohe, Josef Albers, who was one of the 7 remaining masters at the school, and the other 6 masters. And Mies wrote to the others, including Joseph, saying, we have an opportunity to reopen the Bauhaus. I've met with the current German Minister of Propaganda, but to do so, we would have to do it on the terms of the Third Reich. And I assume that you agree with me that we should not reopen the school. And indeed, the Bauhaus was closed. Annie and Joseph met the American architect Philip Johnson in Berlin. Philip asked, would you like to come to America? Annie
He was a German sympathizer, Nazi sympathizer.
I could hear that interruption. Yes, Philip was a very complicated person and indeed a Nazi sympathizer. I, in fact, am the person who found the letter in which he said that Hitler had good ideas, and I gave that to his biographer. And yet, one of the great surprises about Philip is that he was the person who rescued the Alberses. And without him, they, and then eventually Annie's family, all the other members of the family, would not have gotten out of Germany. Philip proposed that Joseph Albers teach at Black Mountain College, a new school in North Carolina. They didn't even know where North Carolina was. Philip let them know that it was not, as they assumed, in the Philippines, but that it was in the American South. And he made it a very welcoming place for them. A very, very complicated character, very fascist in some of his politics in the 30s. He supported Father Coughlin, in my opinion, a horrible figure, but at the same time, he could be very human in some of his personal relations. And as you may know, his house remains a museum in New Canaan, Connecticut, and is a fascinating place. Next, please. Once they were in America, the Alberses continued to create very beautiful abstract art. This is a painting of Joseph's, which in many ways is euphoric. using pure color to establish an absolutely wonderful mood. Next, please. And then Joseph began to apply paint to a pure white background, and it often looks as if there is one paint color on top of another. But in fact, each of these paints was applied directly to the white background. And when you think you're looking at a mixture of paints, you're not. You are, in fact, just looking at a pure color that appears to be a mixture of other paints. There is no translucency here, but rather, as I say, each paint on its white background. And in that workroom of his on Birchwood Drive, I had the experience of looking at this very painting with Joseph when he asked me which color I saw the most of, the pink, the sort of brown red, the purer red, or the gold. And I studied it. I believe that I answered the pink. Joseph said that if he asked that question of 20 people, he would hope to get all 4 possible answers, because we all perceive colors in different ways. And in fact, there was an equal quantity of each color. And if we think we see more of one than the other, it's because of our own vision and also because of the personality of the color, which makes us feel that we're seeing it in greater quantity. By the way, it's not something that would interest people in every audience, but for those of you tuned in today, it delighted Joseph that as you crossed the town line, driving on the Wilbercross Parkway, there was a sign in green with the lettering in white that said, "This is orange." And Joseph used to say that it was a perfect example of the deceptiveness of names to describe colors. Next, please. Annie, in her weaving, once she got to the United States, took great delight in her new freedom. She had more texture in her work. This is quite a large wall hanging, if you can picture it being about 4 feet across. And it has been one of the highlights of that exhibition I mentioned to you in Valencia. She let thread and shape be a source of absolutely lasting beauty. Next, please. Annie, in 1942, set about to make some jewelry. She had grown up with emeralds and diamonds. Her parents had lost everything from a material point of view, but fortunately, in 1940, they were on one of the last ships out of Germany, one turned down by the United States. It ended up docking in Mexico, in Veracruz, but they lost everything that they had in the way of material wealth, as I said. But Annie's solution was to extract beauty from inexpensive materials. She was an alchemist, as was Joseph. She could take bobby pins and a utility chain and a piece of ribbon and ordinary washers, the products of a hardware store or a 5 and 10 cent store, and turn them into art objects that gained recognition almost immediately in 1942. And as recently as the current issue of the World of Interiors, a very fancy English magazine, continues to gain attention. Next, please. Annie made this wonderful weaving shortly before she and Joseph moved from New Haven to Orange. When she moved to Orange, she gave up her looms and worked only on printmaking. But in this weaving, she uses thread and thread alone to create a triumphant abstraction. She called it open letter. In many ways, she thought of it as her communication to Joseph. She was fascinated with nonverbal language, the things we say through gesture, through mood, and in ways that do not always translate to words. And if you look at it carefully, You'll see little elements of surprise. There are several orange lines in it. They're barely visible in the slide, but you can take my word for it that the orange offers a wonderful surprise. I was once with the clothing designer Paul Smith looking at work by Annie and Joseph together. It was at a show in Milan, and Paul said, you know, the wonderful thing about her work is surprise. It's the most important thing a designer can offer. Next, please. Annie, in 1966, had a commission from the Jewish Museum in New York to do a memorial to the victims of the Holocaust. And she did very large panels. Picture each of these a little bit taller than a human being. Imagine them on exhibition in Paris as they were for that show I mentioned to you. They are the most extraordinary evocation of 6 million lives, and the idea of lives intertwined, more people than we can count, the idea of infinity. And the work has a sobriety which completely serves its memorial purpose. Someone I know is working on a book at the moment on the way that the memory of the Holocaust is treated, and he considers this to be one of the most beautiful examples to come out of the 20th century. Next, please. This painting, called Equal and Unequal, hung in Annie's living room and bedroom on Birchwood Drive. It was an image that always fascinated her. Joseph had made it in 1939. She was always trying to understand the textures and relate the forms. After about 20 years of walking into that house, one day I came to think of it as a portrait of the Alberses, two august presences, two very powerful people, communicating with each other, reaching out toward each other, sometimes resisting each other in some of the reactions that are a natural part of a long marriage. There's lasting 50 years until Joseph's death. Next, please. Joseph, as I said, became best known for the paintings he began creating in 1950, the homages to the square. He did almost 3,000 paintings in all, in a variety of sizes. There are certain things in common with all of them. They all have the same mathematical proportions. If you look at the measurements underneath the central square, they are doubled to the left and right of that central square and tripled above it. And as a result of this particular arrangement, you get movement in and out, upwards and downwards, forwards and backwards. It's flat, it's three-dimensional. And Joseph always began each painting in the center. He told me that his father, who taught him how to paint a door, said that if you begin at the center and work your way out, you catch the drips and you don't get your cuffs dirty. And Joseph followed that idea. And yet, as we look at the paintings, sometimes you feel that the middle square is painted on top of other colors. It is not. Sometimes you feel that it is further away. It is not. He picked the right colors to create illusions. You also can have the feeling that the squares are shaded, that they move from light to dark, but in fact, they're painted flat. They are just responding to the effect of one color on another. Next, please. Here we see Annie and Joseph at home. One of those people who visited them both in New Haven and in Orange was the great photographer Henri Cartier-Bresson, who evoked the presence of these two highly intelligent, determined, and celebrative people. Next. Annie, toward the end of her life, after Joseph died in 1976, continued her printmaking. which she had begun in the 1960s. And at the very end, as I said, after Joseph died, she had developed a real tremor in her hand. She could no longer draw straight lines, but lying in bed on Birchwood Drive, she would look out at a stone wall that reminded her in turn of a stone wall, of a Mayan stone wall that she had loved on one of the 14 trips she and Joseph took to Mexico. And she used the shake of her hand to create the irregularity of the pattern that you see in this print on your right. And she hand colored a number of these prints, and they are the conclusion of that exhibition on in Valencia at the moment. 12 of these hand colored prints made in orange, celebrating the sense that so often what we think of as our limitation is a source of great possibility. Next, please. And finally, I'm going to take you inside the Alberses' house, if you can imagine this. In January of 1976, I arrived there one day and asked Joseph how he was, and he said, nicht so gut, Nick, schlecht. And then he explained that he was having trouble doing an homage the way that he wanted. He needed to have each color appear to penetrate the other. He needed not to make it look as if each was painted on the white background, but as if there was some translucency. And he needed exactly the right paint to do this in the format with the large central square. He told me that he had done studies and he could achieve his goals with a Winsor Newton paint number 192, but the new Winsor Newton batch 205 didn't serve his purposes. I called Kay's Art Shop, other art supply stores in Connecticut. No one had the old Winsor Newton cobalt green. But then I called the corporate headquarters in New Jersey. They're an English company. And the person on the other end of the phone said, and it was the head of the division, there's no difference between our batches 192 and 205. And I said, well, sir, Joseph Albers thinks there's a difference. Joseph Albers. 2 days later, a box of 5 tubes of paint arrived at Birchwood Drive, and Joseph made this painting. And he said he needed the central square to be big because for him, it was the cosmos. And as he said, the colors had to be just right so that the cosmos did not have sharp boundaries or exact corners. The cosmos needed to be reached very softly, very gradually. It needed to intertwine with the earth and the sea. And so Joseph really wanted that large square, that central square large, because as he explained, the cosmos was getting much nearer to him. And that was his last painting. As I said, he and Annie chose to be buried in Orange. It was a town that received them well, made them comfortable. Joseph, at the end of his life, would go to Mass and confession rather regularly. He began to practice Catholicism again. Annie said that her having been baptized, although she was of a Jewish background, there had been a family conversion and she was baptized, enabled her to fulfill the requirements to get into that part of the cemetery where they wanted to be under a tree that they had carefully selected. Speaking to you in Orange is a very special treat for reasons of doing what I can to make these spectacular people alive to you and to make their work alive to you. I would gladly take any questions.
Does anyone have any questions? I know I do.
I'm ready, Rebecca.
Okay, so have been at the library for 12 years now, and um, I'm sure a lot of people here are aware we have a really wonderful collection of signed Albers prints on our walls. Can you tell us more about those prints, how they were selected, um, how they came to be here?
Well, I cannot remember who initiated the discussion, but it must have been someone at the library, and it was very much my decision that the library should have beautiful prints by the Alberses. As I keep emphasizing, the town meant so much to them, the sense of welcome. You may be familiar with the play by Thornton Wilder called Our Town, which is an idyllic image of an American town. Thornton Wilder, in fact, was the um, first American to buy a print by Josef Albers in 1934. And Joseph did wonderful photographs of him. And I've always thought that there was something of the Our Town spirit in what orange represented to them. But they had such a sense of home in the town that even though eventually our foundation could no longer remain there, we were in an all residential neighborhood, it seemed totally appropriate that your wonderful library have a good selection of work by both of them.
Yeah, and it's a wonderful addition to the library. Absolutely. So I do have a few questions in the chat. Can you explain the work of the foundation, and is there an exhibit place there?
We do have an exhibition place. We're in Bethany. The main purpose of our foundation is to be a storage place for work that we in turn lend to museums. So I've mentioned the show in Spain. This coming fall, there's going to be a big exhibition at the Albers Museum in Joseph's hometown of Bottrop in Germany. And there's going to be another show in The Hague in the Netherlands. And we mainly lend. So one of the purposes of the foundation is research. One is to make sure that we weed out fakes. There is an enormous problem with fakes of Joseph's work. I'm going to be in a trial in Milan in June, having to do with not the first instance of someone knowingly doing and selling fake homages to the square. And our foundation also, about 20 years ago, created another nonprofit called La Corsa, which operates in rural Senegal, really fulfilling the Alberses' mission of trying to bring health and education to a local population and using what Joseph used to call minimal means for maximum effect. For relatively little money, we've recently built a marvelous hospital, pediatric and maternity unit there in rural Senegal. We have artist studios in a small village in Senegal. And so we bring some of the Alberses' legacy to a very different part of the world.
Oh, that's really great. Very inspiring.
Thank you.
So let's see, we have, and anyone, please feel free to unmute yourself if you wanted to ask your question verbally. That would be fun too. I'll go to the next question. Can you, let's see, do you have a picture of the Alberses' graves?
Unfortunately, not one that I can show you here, but we certainly do have photographs of it. And I will say that Annie and I designed those gravestones together. They're very simple rectangular blocks, and the carving on them is in what was her very, very favorite typeface, or Joseph's favorite typeface, called Sabone Antigua, designed by a graphic designer named Jan Chicolt. My family was in the printing business in Hartford, and from there, we arranged to have the names set in Sabone, and Annie, in a very Annie Albers way, had everything set except for her death date. She left that with an open dash, and the gravestones were created exactly as she requested. I just saw a question flash in front of me, which was whether they had children. And the answer, quite simply, is that they did not have children. I've heard various hypothetical reasons as to why, but one of the likely reasons is that Annie suffered from a genetic disorder called Murray-Charcot tooth syndrome, and she could well have been found it very physically difficult to bear children and to raise children, and at the same time could have been fearful of the genes being passed on.
Yeah. So let's see. Why did her teacher not want her to use black, and did it have anything to do with her being a woman?
It was because he was teaching a very traditional Impressionist method of painting. And according to the tenets of Impressionism, black paint did not have the right quality of light to be used in the work.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so we have another question. In his painting of the earth, sky, and sea, the margins are close to the bottom edge, more than equal on each side. Why did he do that?
This is his usual format, where underneath the central square, whatever measurements you see are doubled to the left and right of the central square and tripled above it. And he did that to impart a particular movement and even a deliberate tension in the artwork.
And what does the library have of Annie's work?
You know, we made that gift a fair while ago, and you would have better access to a list than I do. I remember wanting the library to have a range of prints that really gave a very good idea of her different approaches to printmaking. Printmaking was always a great adventure for her. She didn't just want to reproduce a drawing, she wanted to get into the technique of making prints. And so she would take an image and then overprint it, turn 90 degrees, or she would see something come out of the process where she could mix photo offset and screen printing. She used an acid bath. She was very interested in exploring technique, and I wanted you to have a sense of that exploration.
Yeah, we do have a really great variety of their prints here. I would be happy if anyone is interested in showing the collection and showing you which of the prints are Josef Albers prints and which are Anni Albers prints. I think as you spend more time with them, you can kind of see the artistic differences in those works to spot them pretty easily, I would say. Were the Albers active in other ways in the community in Orange? Did they eat out? Which church did Josef go to? Any other local activities?
He went to the church of, if I'm remembering the name correctly, of the Good Shepherd.
Yeah.
The Holy Infant. And now I'm suddenly blanking on the name for all the times that I drove by it. I think it is the Holy Infant. And to answer the question about their eating out, I've written a lot about where they ate out. In a book I wrote about the iPhone as the embodiment of the Bauhaus belief system, because I discussed the way that the Alberses particularly loved things that worked efficiently and well. And they often talked about this when they ate at the restaurant called the Plank House on the Boston Post Road. I don't know, can someone tell me if the Plank House is still there? It's been a long time since I've been on the Post Road in that neighborhood, but it was a place where normally one saw maybe people who had been shopping at the local Sears Roebuck, or you would see, people who worked in local businesses. And then this distinguished elderly German couple would arrive under the porte cochere, often with a guest who could have been, Anthony Armstrong Jones or the actor Maximilian Schell. These are some of the people who went in there with them. And Joseph, I remember I ate there with them frequently, loved the tabletops because they were covered in polyurethane, which he felt was so easy to sponge. And he marveled at the salad bar. This is early 1970s, before salad bars were so familiar to us. And even then, pre-COVID, the Plank House had a plastic shield, which appealed to Joseph. It was very sanitary in its nature. And then it had a marvelous selection of things that he loved. Pickled beets, which reminded him of his childhood in Germany. He was very nostalgic for local foods. So the Plank House was really an important institution to them. They liked the food, they liked the system. People were friendly to them. It all worked well as far as they were concerned. And they also were extremely partial to Phrases Market, which is where they did almost all of their grocery shopping, and were always, treated deferentially in a way that must have been extremely nice for them.
That's a really good question. I don't think that the Plank House is still there. Does anyone know about where it would have been located?
I mean,
It's a little before my time.
If you went down 114 from the Alberses house to the Post Road and you turned right, the Plank House appeared shortly thereafter.
Okay.
Is Phrases still there? Do we know? That was at the corner of 114 and the Post Road.
Yeah, that I think was.
It's long gone.
Yeah, it left a number of years ago, well over a decade ago, I think.
The local photocopy shop was also very important to them because they, this is before the era of computer printing. And Joseph loved having multiple copies made of certain documents or of letters that he was mailing out or so on. And there was a woman named Mrs. Fago who ran the copy shop, and they would call in on her probably 3 times a week.
I imagine, pre-email, something like the copy shop would have been very important.
Oh, also, the memories are coming back to me. Sears Roebuck was their go-to store, and Annie, when she was in a wheelchair, used to love to go there with my wife, and Annie would do what she called treasure hunting. And treasure hunting meant finding the perfect white blouse, maybe for $5, or finding Tupperware containers, which she would call the dream of the Bauhaus.
She sounds like a really interesting woman.
She was as colorful as could be, and a very funny woman too. You could see from her photograph, she was quite austere looking, and the people who met her in town would probably describe her as austere. But when asked who she could have been if it were any other woman of the 20th century, she replied, Mae West.
That's a good choice. We have another question. I'm not sure if you would know the answer to this, but are the Albers Orange's most famous past residents?
I'm not the one who's able to answer that, not having been an Orange resident or historian myself. Does anyone else out there know?
My guess would be that that's a question for the Historical Society. I certainly can't think of anyone more famous, but yeah, we'll have to think about that one. So there's another question here about what Joseph taught at Yale.
What he taught at Yale.
Yes, what courses did he teach at Yale?
He headed the Department of Design, which was of Architecture and Design, which was created in essence for him in 1950. So he taught drawing and color theory and approaches to painting and design until 1959.
What happened to Annie's family that came to the States?
Well, her mother and father first, after meeting up with them in Mexico and spending some time at Black Mountain College with them, her father ended up working on a loading dock. Her mother briefly as a waitress at a restaurant in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Her father outlived her mother by a number of years. Annie had a wonderful younger brother, 10 years younger than she, who lived in Old Greenwich with his wife and 3 children. And her younger sister, who was only 18 months younger than she was, who lived in the Cambridge area. And Annie certainly knew her nieces and nephews and their children, but I cannot say that family was all that important to them. Joseph's family was pretty much cut off from him. He had felt that his father was anti-Semitic when he was marrying Annie, and Joseph had no patience for that sort of prejudice, and his conclusion was simply, well, then his father shouldn't be at his wedding. So her family in any case did survive, as did many other people who the Alberses helped get out of Germany.
What was her maiden name? I don't know if I caught that.
I probably forgot to say it, but her name at birth was Anneliese Elsa Frieda Fleischmann. And her mother's family were the Ullsteins of publishing fame. I'm seeing the question if Joseph's family remained in Germany, and indeed they did. He had, his one brother was killed in the First World War, but he had 2 sisters who remained. And I was with them at Birchwood Drive after one of his sisters, the one he preferred, had died, and her husband sent Joseph a fantastic self-portrait that Joseph had done in about 1919. And it was a very dramatic moment, some 60 years later, almost 60 years later, to see this beautiful drawing come into the house.
I'll bet there's, well, I shouldn't say that. Do you think there's still more work of theirs to discover, or have you unearthed it all?
We keep getting surprises, Rebecca. It's a great question. Just when I think we've seen and know everything that they did, something pops up. Or else there are works that we know have disappeared and that we would love desperately to find.
Sure, yeah. That must be really exciting when you come across something new.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know if you talked about this and I missed it, but how did you become acquainted with the Alberses?
I became acquainted because I was an undergraduate at Columbia College in New York when I would spend summers teaching tennis in New Hampshire. And I was interested in a young woman who was also teaching tennis. She did not feel about me as I did about her. It was sort of, you're a nice guy, but in any case, she took me to meet her parents, who were Albers collectors. And I saw Annie's work for the first time. I knew Joseph slightly. I fell in love with what I saw. And my friend's mother decided that she should take me to meet the Alberses. I was then in graduate school in art history at Yale. And that's when Ruth August, the collector, took me to Birchwood Drive for the first time. And the rest was history. My life changed that very day.
Yeah, and I imagine that must have been a pretty incredible experience to meet, such prominent artists that you admired.
And people who were so much the real thing. They had such total integrity, such total belief in making art. They didn't talk about art and money. They didn't talk about trends or what was chic. They really talked about lasting beauty.
Yeah, I imagine that must have been pretty inspiring.
Endlessly.
Does anybody have any other questions? Okay, I think,
Thank you.
yeah, this was absolutely fascinating and really informative and wonderful. And I'm so glad we got to learn more about Josef and Anni Albers, more than I ever, I think, could have hoped to know. I really appreciate the insider look into their art and their life and who they were. This was really exceptional. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so very much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And for those of you who might wish